So, I came across this video about, Professor Jiang going into Marxism, and I instantaneously became curious. I took a quick look at the chapters in particular, and the shift away from worker centric society in the 1980s. Is he going to make the argument that the New Deal made it such that the bourgeoisie and the rich were not in control still of the economic modes of production as a byproduct of the New Deal? Okay. First off, no. I had no idea that capital as a broader concept was abolished because of the New Deal passing. Now, that's some fucking news to me, okay? Unless I've read all the history books wrong. But then again, we're talking about a dude who has a BA in fucking literature and is pretending to call himself a fucking professor. So, yeah. Well, why don't we take a look and see this, I don't know, stalwart of Marxist academics try to explain how consumerism is the perfection of slavery. Okay, let's take a look.
All right. Now, what's amazing about Marx is that today we say he's wrong, right? Communism happened in the Soviet Union and happened in China, but it happened in Europe and in the United States, where Marx said it would happen first because Germany was more industrialized than Russia or China. Okay, does that make sense? That's what we say. If you think about it deeply, okay, Marx is right. After World War II, every society, every industrial society, to some extent, adopted the ideas of communism. It doesn't make sense. Okay.
Okay. So just in that 50 seconds alone, there's a lot wrong here. All right. Oh boy. Marx, a lot of his philosophical sort of axioms and sort of rigor more or less comes from Hegel. And the reason why Marx specifically said that communism was going to emerge in Europe was because of the current material conditions of industrial capitalism that are taking place within Germany, Britain, France, due to all of these industrialists, the bourgeoisie, as Marx would have called them, owning a bunch of factories. Marx also stipulated that a lot of this, and this is mostly based off of historical materialism, Marx stipulated that part of the necessity for the proletariat to not necessarily have like an understanding, I suppose, but kind of to have an understanding for let's just go with the kind of have an understanding of the current conditions they find themselves under. There's a reason why the Communist Manifesto was handed out to workers by the Communist Party, that of course, when it was being run by Marx, out into a bunch of differing factory workers. As a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution, what was necessary? The creation of public education. Because as everything started to shift away from a more feudal serfdom work into more people moving into cities where industrial centers were generally speaking being established, it became necessary to begin to educate the proletariat to provide some form of public education for these people to be able to know how to operate the machines. So, when Marx was talking about the proletariat, generally speaking, he would be talking about what is essentially now known as people in the middle class. Now, the middle class in of itself is a bit of a misnomer. It has some issues there. In particular, it's mostly just to create like class distinction and divides between, of course, the lower classes from the upper classes that still exploit them. Obviously, it is purely meant to be as a divider, mostly, as basically made by rich people and politicians and whatnot. Yada yada yada. That's a completely sort of different thing. the purpose of having an educated proletariat is so they have an understanding about how the bourgeoisie, the factory owners, the industrialists, the owners of the means of production are exploiting them for their labor specifically. Which is why it sort of ended up inevitably collapsing in both Russia and the Soviet Union. So, Russia, still pre-industrial, very agrarian, still feudal, and very much so still mostly with rural peasants and serfs. Same with China, although they were completely just pre-industrial, still an agrarian-based economy, still feudal in nature. Maoism was a sort of way to be able to sort of bridge the gap that Marx creating the sort of necessity of there being to have to be a more educated industrial based like inner city sort of proletariat, trying to justify the workings of socialism with agrarian sort of rural peasants rising up with mostly guerrilla tactics and warfare in order to be able to violently depose the capital, the owner class, and also the bourgeoisie, right? So there's some complications there, obviously, with Marx. There's a reason why it didn't really necessarily work out there within China. There's a lot of inherent contradictions there with what Mao also said, but it kind of sort of worked out for Mao. Sort of, there were still a lot of fucking problems. All the famines that happened there, yada yada yada. Mao's not exactly a great statesman. He's a pretty bad statesman, I would generally speaking say. And then we have the Bolsheviks, right? The thing with the Bolsheviks in particular, and even Lenin himself said this, is, okay, guys, we still kind of have to do capitalism before we can even think about transitioning into socialism and communism. So Lenin was going through the necessary steps, beginning to rapidly set up and sow the seeds of rapid industrialization of the Soviet Union. Not necessarily through the 5-year plans. I mean, that's something that Stalin ended up doing, but Stalin completely veered to the left and just basically did his own thing. But Lenin basically more or less had the right idea in terms of following through with the necessary sort of transition steps, whereas with Mao, not so much. The problem was when Stalin took over and the revolution in Germany failed, by the KPD, along with the SPD basically stabbing the KPD in the back, to put that in a extreme sort of TLDR, very, very much so extreme TLDR. Stalin basically just decided, I'm just going to make up Marxism-Leninism, which is a complete sort of like revisionist telling for as to how Marxism is supposed to fucking work. Come up with his own state ideology and just essentially do state fucking capitalism. And that's why the Soviet Union inherently fell apart, because of its own internal contradictions with its own ideology. So it's not really because of, like, Marx was correct in that it was supposed to start with a more educated proletariat, but it got kind of like a little wonky in terms of a lot of its implementations and interpretations across the world.
We call this socialism, not communism, but basically it adheres to the thinking of Marx, which is to make the worker the heart and center of your society. And why did they do that after World War II? Exactly, okay? Because workers create value.
Okay, we're doing a little bit of skipping. This isn't really a post-World War II thing. No, this was a more post-Depression thing, right? Because the Great Depression happened and the New Deal was passed mostly because of pressure from the fucking socialists and the communists. There was I don't remember the name of the documentary, but essentially in 1929, capitalism failed. Its internal contradictions were too much for the system to handle, and it collapsed, right? In the culmination of the Great Depression, right? So it collapsed, the communists were right, and were basically slated to completely take over. Capitalism was dead. The socialists and the communists, the workers' councils, were basically ready and set to take over. However, FDR stepped in and basically said, listen, we can't basically depose all the systems. We can't. I can't make a fucking compromise, right? The powers that be are obviously the industrialists, the bourgeoisie, blah, 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 blah. FDR was a little bit of a class trader. He basically said, I can make a compromise to essentially save American capitalism. We can't do socialism. The violent revolution is not going to be allowed to happen. He would basically would have put a stop to the revolution, to the dictatorship of the proletariat that was slated to basically take over the United States of America. And he did this through the New Deal, a compromise deal, because basically, if the New Deal was not signed into place as a byproduct of the Great Depression happening, and I believe when was the New Deal signed again? It was in the 30s. I know it was in the early 30s was when it was signed. But basically, if it was not signed, America would have basically been in open civil war, and the communists more than likely would have been able to take over alongside the workers, and essentially establishing a socialist republic of the United States of America. But the New Deal basically prevented that. 1933. Yes, okay. It was early 30s. I was just not certain if it was 1933 or not. Okay, so it was 1933. So, New Deal goes in, capitalism is essentially saved, and then World War II happens. And here's the thing. Significantly higher tax rates were put onto the bourgeoisie. The social security system was created. A bunch of workers' protections were granted. That's not communism. That's not socialism. That's not the dictatorship of the proletariat. That is not a quote-unquote worker-central society. The fundamental relationship between bourgeois and proletariat still existed after the signing of the New Deal. Nothing, I'm not going to say that nothing changed. There were some big changes, right? The wealthy industrialists, capitalists, were not able to sort of be as exploitative and were forced to have to pay a ton more in taxes to make sure that the system doesn't collapse in on itself. It became significantly more regulated. But the relationship, and this is what Marx always talks about, still fundamentally existed.
Okay. Money doesn't create any value. Money just creates more money. It's okay, speculative. But the workers create value. They're productive. And therefore, you have to treat your workers properly. So in America and in Europe, workers became...
Okay, money is, technically speculative, but money is just a... Okay. Money is just as Marx would say, money is just a form of use value that we use to have a basically universal way to be able to do commerce and trade with one another. That's the purpose of money. It's not speculative inherently. Like, it's used for speculative purposes nowadays, but during those times of the New Deal, I think essentially that stuff was significantly cracked down upon, or was just not really allowed to be able to, it was significantly cracked down upon. It was significantly cracked down upon by the implementation of Glass-Steagall, which I believe was also part of the New Deal, if I recall correctly, to make it such that the American financial system doesn't collapse in on itself. But speculation was much harder as a byproduct of the New Deal.
The heart and center of your society. And the workers, through unions, could demand political reforms. And so all society was geared towards making the lives of the middle class, the working class, better, okay? That's why you had excellent healthcare, great public schools, cheap universities, okay? So the 50s and 60s and 70s was basically the peak of society for the working class. But in the 80s...
Okay, so 50s and 60s was the peak of the working class. Okay. There's a bit of issue here. Okay. So, significant subsidies. Was American healthcare really, really good in the 50s and 60s? I have no idea about the history of healthcare in America, but a significant amount of subsidies were given to universities by the states to their state universities via rulings from the federal government, right? By subsidies that they were granted in order to be able to subsidize universities. So that is true, and made it such that it was very cheap to go to university to get a very good education on, well, basically one fucking income, which was very, very good, generally speaking, for the working class and the proletariat of America, generally speaking, was what ended up creating the middle class, mostly the white middle class, of course, because in the New Deal and the GI Bill, because the GI Bill also comes into play to this as well. Medicare wasn't law until LBJ. That's what I thought as well. So healthcare was probably still pretty dog shit within the United States of America, but whatever. There was no like state subsidized healthcare, from what I recall correctly, during like between the 50s and 60s within America. But I digress. The thing specifically with what was it? It was education, right? Well, in the middle class, with the middle class and the GI Bill, the New Deal, a lot of those benefits did not go to a lot of the minority populations that were living within the inner cities of America, causing white flight, causing there to eventually make it such that there was general sort of fraught and fraying of the New Deal. Not everyone who was a part of the proletariat was a beneficiary of, well, the New Deal. It was mostly the white working class.
We start to change this. Why? Why would we want to change the system? It's a great system, right? Marx is right. Having the worker as the heart and center of your society, as the central organizing unit of your society, makes a lot more sense than having money as the heart and center, okay? But starting in the 80s, we start to go back to money. Why?
Okay. Because of a lot of deregulations done by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the beginning of the creation of neoliberalism and the financialization of the economy, right? That's basically when it started, and a lot of the provisions of the New Deal were starting to be, well, crawled back. And there's a lot of reasonings as to why this sort of ended up being the case. There was the recession that happened in the 70s as a part of the oil shock that happened, which led to Ronald Reagan, which was pretty much one of the main reasons why Ronald Reagan ended up getting into power, and that's pretty much what I think sank Jimmy Carter's presidency. I think it was Jimmy Carter who was in power during that time. He was around the 70s. And sort of helped to create the further financialization of the economy. So, like, for example, 401k system, having pensions and retirement funds tied to the stock market. That was Reagan. That was Reagan who did that. And a lot of more further tax cuts. That was Reagan. The destruction of university subsidies. That was also Reagan under the guidance of Lee Atwater, saying, "Yeah, we can't risk really having an educated proletariat because they may start to rise up against us specifically, and that could be some potential big problems." So that's what's basically more or less led to the financialization of the economy. I'm not 100% familiar with what exactly happened within Britain that also helped in tandem with this, but generally speaking, it's widely regarded as Reagan and Thatcher being the two main pieces of shit who essentially created the current neoliberal laissez-faire capitalist system that we find ourselves under right now, which is starting to collapse.
Excuse me?
Wait, does he actually have fucking people in there? He actually has people in there. Jesus Christ. I want to quick reminder to everyone. This guy's not actually a professor. He graduated with a BA in fucking literature. He is a high school teacher. So, I don't know, does he have like some high school students in there or something? Like, I have no fucking idea. Like, I'm a little confused here.
Who wants more? Yes, exactly. So what happened in the 80s?
I really can't hear... Man, the individual there was really quiet. I have no idea what the fuck she asked. He? Are they? I have no idea.
It's something called the revolt of the elite. Okay? In other words, the problem with having a society based on the worker is it becomes too egalitarian, too equal, right? But if you're like the elite, you don't want equality, you want difference. You want to have power and money in your hands. Does that make sense? So the revolt of the elite happened in the 80s, and this is what we call...
Okay. He's not entirely wrong here. He's missing one fundamental detail. This didn't happen just in the 80s. This is a culmination of a lot of work, broadly speaking, done by the bourgeoisie. I don't really like using the term elite all that much. It's typically used in a more conspiratorial sort of context, but whatever. The bourgeoisie, the rich, the billionaires, corporations, what have you, were working the entire time, even after the New Deal was implemented, to chip away at provisions of it. And they always lobbied the government in order to be able to chip away at it. I don't remember... God, what was the one Supreme Court ruling that passed that was before Citizens United? Because Citizens United was pretty much what basically created legalized corruption. Do you guys remember in chat... Vallejo v. what? Vallejo v. what? Because I think that was passed in the 50s. Let me double check that, actually. So here, yeah, Buckley v. Vallejo. So this was a decision by the Supreme Court on campaign finance. Majority of justices held that, as provided by Section 608 of the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971, limits on elections expenditures were unconstitutional, basically making it such that you want to spend as much money as you want on campaign expenditures, go right ahead. Who gives a shit, right? In a per curam by the court opinion, they ruled that expenditure limits contravene the First Amendment provision on free speech because a restriction on spending for political communication necessarily reduces the quantity of expression. So this is basically where the idea of corporations also have free speech. Yeah, money is now essentially fucking speech. Legalized corruption is now, put in place. Whereas where we have now Citizens United, that's what it is, basically making it such that it caused Buckley v. Vallejo to essentially be blown out of the water. There's a reason why if you're going to be talking about Citizens United, you also have to talk about Buckley v. Vallejo, which is essentially the progenitor of Citizens United, making it such that, the expression that money is now speech effectively is what ended up creating the sort of conditions that we have right now, right? And this is a sort of thing that, it wasn't just... This is something that has been, broadly speaking, been building up towards for the latter part of several fucking decades, culminating into this, where now corporations lobby through mostly lobbying firms can essentially just freely lobby to politicians and begin to corrupt politicians to take more pro-corporate stances. So this wasn't really a quote-unquote revolt of the elites. The elites, after the passing of Buckley v. Vallejo and then eventually Citizens United, were allowed to now have pretty much full fucking control over the U.S. political system.
In the United States, the Reagan Revolution, okay? The Reagan Revolution. The beginning of Neoliberalism, free market capitalism. And in Britain, it was called Thatcherism, okay? Margaret Thatcher, the Thatcher Revolution.
Capitalism was still pretty much the norm of economic production throughout the 50s and 60s, and the 40s and the 30s, right? The only time where it was pretty much collapsing was because of the Great Depression in 1929, and the New Deal ended up saving it.
And so now you need to transition away from the worker to something else, okay? Another ideology that allows the elite to amass power, okay? So just to show you how radical this revolution was. In the 1970s, if you were a CEO, the head of a company, okay? You were making on average $1 million a year. That's pretty good, right? That's really good money.
For back then, yeah.
$1 million was more than 20 times the worker. And that's pretty reasonable. Today, the average CEO in the United States makes $20 million a year. And that is 200 to 300 times more than the average worker in the company. Does that make sense?
So, yeah, well, disparity is really bad.
In the 80s, inequality started to explode, right? And so they're transitioning from the worker to a new organizing unit called the consumer.
Okay, so still there's so many fucking problems here. No, because since we're already fundamentally working off of a really, really shaky basis here, workers are already consumers. As much of a piece of shit as Ford is, right? Not Premier Ford, but Henry Ford, the wealthy industrialist. His sort of idea of his workers also being the consumers of his product is kind of where I think he's trying to grab this from specifically. Workers and consumers are not the same thing. In a Marxist sense, a worker is I guess for lack of a better term, a unit that produces value for a firm or a company or a capitalist, right? They produce value with their labor by creating a product, a widget, a what have you, right? That gets sold for a profit, and the worker is paid a wage based off of what the capitalist thinks is, worthwhile for that sort of amount of fucking labor. Complete control of, that relationship there in terms of how a worker gets paid by a capitalist. Consumers are just people who go out and consume products. They are the people that capitalists are supposed to appeal to get their products in order to be able to make money, in order to be able to make more of a product, in order to keep making more money, keep making a further product. That's really about it. Workers are technically consumers, but they don't technically need to consume from the same sort of... It's not like a self-sustaining loop, per se. It's a little bit more complicated than that. It's... To say that a consumer and a worker is the same thing is not exactly the sort of same thing, because, as Professor Jiang does point out here, with wealth inequality exploding, that's going to make it such that the consumers can't consume. Think about it, right? People are not going to have as much money, and this was starting to become more and more prominent under the Reagan administration, with, of course, the productivity wage gap graph, that wages are not keeping up with inflation. With consumers, it is becoming much more difficult to be able to consume, products, which is the main thing that's supposed to be the driver of economic production within a capitalist society. Financialization pretty much completely upends that relationship, where essentially, if we could explain financialization in the simplest of terms possible, it's essentially like, hey, I'm going to make basically a bet on the stock market or on this market that it's going to make a bunch of value, and it's a bunch of people just basically guessing and speculating and gambling, for lack of a better term, saying this thing is going to make money because we just think it's going to make money, and it's all purely based off of, honestly, just feelings and very, very complicated fucking algorithms. That's really about all there is to it with the current financialized system. We are currently, even back then, during the 80s, it was the beginning of the transition from a post-consumer, a consumerist-based society, where essentially money can just make more money, and you can just basically do anything with, money, right? His timeline here, I think, is basically completely out of whack. If anything, the 50s and the 60s were the time of the consumer. So, since we're working off of a rather shaky basis, the rest of the analysis here, I think, is just going to be completely off.
Okay? So they needed to destroy the working class, the middle class. And the way they did it was by introducing a new concept called the consumer, okay? So in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the government promised you a good job. If you were a member of a society, if you were a citizen, I promise you a good job that you would have for the rest of your life, okay? So in the 80s, the government said...
That's not exactly how that works. Okay, the government didn't really promise anyone good jobs. Like, okay... It's not exactly how that works. So you were promised to have a good life if you were following these particular steps. Go to school, get a job, go to university, work while you are also going to university, and then you're going to get like a nice little fucking corporate job. That's kind of like the promise of the American dream. It's very, very TLDR, but that's the basic fucking gist of it, right? And that was essentially what sort of happened, and people were still consuming products and still working and producing for a bunch of corporations still during that time. And then essentially the recognition by the bourgeois was saying like, oh, we basically don't really need these guys anymore because we have now amassed enough sort of like social capital and like, well, monetary sort of capital in order to try to start pushing away from that. Like, Reagan was the main guy who started basically just completely shitting on the working class and created the sort of like financialization of the economy that we are currently living under right now.
I promise you that you have low prices and a wide selection of goods. Okay, does that make sense? All right, so this sounds like a subtle shift going from the worker to the consumer, okay? But what this meant was a revolution in society, a revolution in politics. So remember that, an example of the worker has to have political consciousness in order to protect his or her rights, in order to organize and unify and push for favorable political reforms, okay? That's what the worker must do, okay? But now let's think about the mentality of the consumer. And to do this, let's do another thought experiment. And the thought experiment is this. Everyone in the school, about 500 people, I decide to give everyone $1 million US dollars. Okay? So everyone in the school has exactly $1 million US dollars to spend. What happens now?
Okay.
Think about this. What happens now? Use your imagination. What happens? What's the first thing you do?
I don't know. It depends on the person. Depends on the goal. I'm really failing to see what exactly this thought experiment is supposed to. Is he trying to say that people would just start hoarding away the money in like a corner somewhere or something? Like I'm a little confused. Because I guarantee you, if someone was just given $1 million, you know what would immediately happen? If we're talking about the United States of America, that shit would get immediately fucking taxed. So, yeah, $1 million back in the 80s definitely took you way more of a fucking mile in comparison to what it does now. Let's be honest here, Alex. So, I guess technically speaking, you could have done that back then with $1 million or something, sure, in the 80s. But I don't know. Like, is he going to suggest that it's you just go out there and start consuming or something? But he unironically said with the shit before with the government saying like, oh, you know, look at all these products that we have for I don't know, you to be able to use. He already kind of contradicted himself when he said that the worker does not equate into like a consumer because people are also going to be consuming the products that they're also going to be making. Like it's a little fucking strange. It's weird that he would say that. Like he's kind of like contradicting his initial stuff before for the I don't know 50s and 60s quote unquote being the centralization of the worker. Like this is a little weird. Like I mean it just purely depends on what a person is thinking. Like I don't know, what would I do if I had $1 million? If I had $1 million, I would probably invest half of it. And then just like probably pocket half of it in order to just like moss around in a fucking corner or some shit. I don't fucking know exactly. Like if like $1 million was like plopped in front of me all of a sudden, I'm not exactly certain what I would do with it. Like I'd come up with something at least.
What's the first thing you do? I've given you $1 million. What do you do with it? Well, the first thing you do is buy something, right? What do you want to buy? Well, $1 million is a lot of money. What do you want to buy now?
I mean, if I were to take a guess, I think if most Americans were given $1 million, you know what they'd be doing? Probably paying off their fucking debts. Medical debts, maybe even food debts. It's crazy to fucking say that. Bills that they have to pay, potential evictions they may have to, like, rent that they missed out on. Like, I don't know, there's like a ton of different stuff for, like, Americans or something.
You buy a house, right? That's great. That's a great purchase. Then what do you do? Then what do you do? Okay, first thing is now buys a house. Then
Yeah, a lot of it would go poof in taxes and debt.
what does he do? To me, buy furniture. Then what does he do? There's something that he must do that's very important. What?
Okay, so I see where this is going now. He's gonna make the argument that people would essentially invest in a house and let the house accrue value, and essentially start passing it down. So kind of similar to the main system that happens within the United States of America, I guess. Like how generational wealth, broadly speaking, sort of accrues, I suppose.
What does he buy the house? What does he want to do? He wants to.
Yeah, I like also that's a good point, Boy Meets Mini. Like, if we're talking about in the '80s, where I think where this hypothetical is supposed to work, I guess. So if we're operating under the '80s, would that be enough money to buy a house during that time? Yes. If we're talking about right now, $1 million to buy a house after the IRS takes its own fucking goddamn cut, because that shit would definitely be fucking taxed 1,000% by the U.S. Probably with a good chunk of it would get fucking taxed, because anything that's won through, like, say, a lottery in the United States is slated to get taxed, because if it touches your bank account, it gets taxed. I believe that's how it generally speaking, it works within the United States of America. If we're talking then after it gets taxed, people would then mostly use that money in order to pay off their debts. And then would you have enough money in order to be able to put a down payment on a vehicle? Or not a vehicle. You definitely would be on a vehicle. On a house. In this economy? Now? Assuming, like, let's say $700,000, let's say you pay $50,000 of that in debts, working with nice round numbers, $650,000, you can get some houses in the middle of nowhere with that kind of money very, very easily, right? But anywhere where there is an urban center or like a sort of city or a town, for example, that has a bunch of houses, would you be able to get that with like a $650,000 down payment? Probably for a bunch of different places. It depends on the state, obviously, but broadly speaking, probably not.
Pictures and post on social media, right? So everyone sees it on social media. Then you see this. Now
okay, so he's talking about this in terms. Okay, so this is in the context of right now. So if bringing up social media, no, this is cockamamie. This is nonsense. Then this hypothetical doesn't this like scenario doesn't work. This is completely ignorant of the current U.S. housing market, which is terrible right now.
Huge house in Beijing with lots of fancy furniture. What do you do now? You also want to buy a house. But what kind of house?
Wait, did he say Beijing? Isn't Beijing's housing market like completely fucked? Isn't Beijing's market like about as bad like as the U.S. housing market? Like, what are you talking about here? Like, what? What is the Beijing housing market like? I'm curious. Houses in Beijing. Let's see if I was like trying to buy a house. Yes, it's really expensive, like most cities in Asia. Yeah, that's what I was also thinking as well. It's probably expensive as fuck. Here, I mean, just to take a look. Okay, so this is Hong Kong, not Beijing, but close enough, like big city by China, because he said Beijing, right? Look at these fucking prices, man. For like some of these penthouses, like 1.7 million pounds, right? Like this is Hong Kong's market. I can only assume that it's probably like similar. Kowloon, I don't know where Kwanloon is exactly, but this is like 22 million pounds, I believe. I believe that's what this little F symbol is, if I recall correctly. This is Hong Kong dollars. This little F symbol here, I think, is for pounds. So that's what, 22 million pounds, 3.4 million pounds. Just so I can make sure. Kwanloon. Where's Kwanloon exactly? Kwanloon, China. Major urban area in Hong Kong, okay? So 1 USD is about 8 HKD. So if we're doing like 14 million here, if it's about 8 of that, that'd be $1.8 million ish. So you would, I mean, you'd be able to put a down payment on a house, but you'd still be paying a fucking mortgage and everything. That's still really, really fucking expensive. Here's something, right? That's much smaller: 2 bedrooms, 2 bath, and or 1 bath rather, and living rooms. Like that's probably not as bad, right? You'd only have 100,000 left to pay on the apartment for this in particular with the hypothetical 650K we're working with here. Like that's what I'm basically saying here is, if we're talking about like getting $1 million right now, and I mean, this is in Hong Kong, right? I can only imagine what it's like in Beijing, right? This is just not. This is ludicrous. You're not going to be able to buy. I mean, you can put a down payment on the house. You're not going to own the house. How are you going to be able to pay off the house? You're going to have to get a job, like, in order to be able to continue paying down the mortgage as well as interest on the mortgage. Like, are you going to be able to sustain that off of one income? That's also another fucking question. You'd probably need at least another person. Like, that's not, like, I don't think it's going to fucking happen. This is ludicrous.
House. A bigger house, right? And then what do? You also post pictures, okay? Then how do other people feel? You think this is funny, okay? But this happens all the time. So
yeah, okay, he's making the argument that you would buy a house, you post pictures of it on social media, and then all of a sudden people become jealous of your nice fucking house. Dog, with $1 million, if everyone got $1 million USD, no one would be able to buy a house that's, I don't know, going to accrue enough value for you to get a bigger house, and then a bigger house and a bigger house. That's not how that works. That's not happening. That would be basically a plan decades into the making. That this is ludicrous.
Very quickly, what happens in the school? And you all spend your money, and you all go into debt, right? Because you're in competition with each other to buy the biggest thing. And $1 million is a lot of money, but it's not enough to buy everything, right? So you go into debt, you borrow more money to buy more things. And then what happens?
Okay, so you go into debt to buy more things. Like, did these people not have any jobs or something? I'm a little confused here. Like what exactly is being said here? I'm a little confused.
And then what happens? How do you guys feel about each other? Do you guys have lunch together? Do you guys have dinner together? Do you guys like to share homework together? You guys hate each other, right? At the end of the day, what will happen is you all go into debt, and you all...
What? Oh yeah, everyone now fucking hates each other because they're all in debt, because they all decided to buy a house with their hypothetical $1 million and immediately started going into competition with one another. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, I don't think that's how any of this works. Like, this is like a completely just nonsensical interpretation of the current fucking housing market if you think that this is how this works. Like, what are you talking about? This is silly.
All hate each other, right? So that's consumerism. This is what consumerism is. Consumerism creates a competition in society for prestige, okay? To see who can post the nicest social media pictures. This leads to the individualization.
Okay, then what about in a time when there was no social media? Was there no competition? Like, when everything was just like, I don't know, like news segments on like the television and also like newspapers, was there still like not the same competition? Like, what are you talking about? This is fucking silly. Like, what is being said here?
Or the optimization of you, okay? In other words, you are now unable to act together. You don't want to organize. You don't want to act in solidarity, okay?
Okay, this is where Professor Jiang is completely and utterly wrong. I have talked about this consistently on my channel. Alienation under capitalism, in terms of work, did not happen as a byproduct of the advent of consumerism in the 80s. That's nonsensical. How it essentially happened is back during the 50s. That's a little interesting. With the advent of suburbanization and the creation of the automobile and the interstate highway system. Allow me to explain. When white flight started happening and people began living in the cities, a lot of cities began to deindustrialize. A lot of poor black folks and other minority populations were not able to move out into the suburbs because they didn't have the money in order to be able to do that. This is what the broader sort of concept of what we call white flight, the beginning of suburbanization. Suburbanization also causes this. Instead of being in a more communal, tighter sort of space where basically everything is in a very, very short distance from one another, right? Like in, say, European cities, for example, where everything's like either a bike ride or a quick like bus ride in order to get to a particular location. With the creation of the automobile and the suburbs of America, as well as the interstate system throughout America, which also was used to put down poor black and other minority populations within the United States, but that's a different story. It made it such that people were becoming more socially isolated. People who are neighbors are not interacting with their neighbors, not as much, right? It takes some time for these social relationships to break down, but it was started right around that time, the creation of the automobile, because of a lot of oil companies lobbying the government in order to have reasons for not only their products to be purchased, but for their products to also be consumed by the average American, because it was the cool and the hip thing to own a car, even though cars are wholeheartedly and completely inefficient as a main transportation system, right? Public transportation is significantly more efficient. Buses, trains, trams, even like bicycle paths are way better than a fucking automobile. A automobile carrying only one person while they make a commute to work is highly inefficient in comparison to all of the other methods that I just suggested straight off the top of my head. That was when the beginnings of social isolation and atomization happened in the United States of America. Suburbanization and the resulting white flight from the inner cities out into the outskirts and the suburbs. It was not because of the advent of consumerism by Reagan and Thatcher. That's nonsense.
And ultimately, this means that you develop economic logic, okay? And what is economic logic? It's to see the world only through the lens of capital. Okay, does that make sense? So when you see someone and you're like, okay, well, do I want to date this person? You don't ask, oh, is this person a nice person? You ask yourself, how much money does this person have? Okay, do you understand? You use
what the fuck are you talking about? You don't know that. How the fuck do you know that? You have no idea of, like, what is this, like, strange fucking talking point? Like, what are you waffling on about? Yeah, dude, the first question everyone asks if they're finding a potential partner is how much fucking money that they have, because we're right now in the present times at this current moment where everyone is extremely fucking poor. Like, this is total fucking shallow analysis here if you think that the first question that everyone is going to ask is how much money are you fucking making. Dog, everyone who's in Gen Z knows that everyone is fucking poor as shit and has no fucking goddamn money. Yet people are still, like, hooking up and hanging out all the fucking goddamn time. Like, this is silly.
Economic logic in order to understand the world and to reason and analyze the world, okay? Now, let me ask you this question. Today, is this how China works? Is this how the world works? The answer is yes, okay? Are you like this? Yes, you are like this, okay? You've been brainwashed into thinking that this is the only way to behave and to think. You're in school. Why?
Okay, so he's not entirely wrong when he says this, but the basis for as to how he got to this conclusion is cockamamie and ridiculous. Like, no. This has been a decades-long project that has started ever since the advent of the New Deal. Ever since the because the oil companies were still allowed to fucking exist, and the design the fucking transportation systems of the United States of America. That's when atomization, generally speaking, happened. Not because of like some strange thought experiment that you came up with, or the advent of consumerism in the 80s and in the 80s by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. This is the silly.
Are you in school? So you can get a good job. Why? To make money, and so you can buy things. Okay, you understand? That's how you all think. But there are different ways to think about school, right? You're like, I'm in school to learn, to open my mind, to have an imagination, to think critically about the world, right? And that was the way we thought about school when the workers were dominant. But now that consumers are dominant, all we think about is, how do I get a good job? How do I buy a bigger house?
No. No. Like I said before, his timeline is basically off by about 30 years. That was a sort of mentality that was established in the 50s and the 60s. This is nonsense. This is why I'm saying the inherent, like, foundational principles that this guy is using for his point here are completely off basis. Universities were subsidized heavily during the 50s and the 60s because people wanted an educated or more educated proletariat at the time in order to be able to go into the emerging office economy, to begin transitioning away from the United States being an export economy as a byproduct of them winning World War II and then not having to ship out, arms and ammunition out everywhere anymore. They began to try to transition more into a service-based, more technologically advanced sort of economy, one based significantly more within science and less based on exports. They were using the export economy, the remaining export economy with all the factory jobs that initially drove American success in World War II and as a byproduct of the New Deal into propelling into this surface-based economy that began to fully take over and emerge into around the 80s and the 90s. And now that was essentially used as another transitionary point to get to where we are now, where essentially the people within power, the bourgeoisie, the rich, the corporations, what have you, are trying to head to a post-consumer society. Essentially saying that we no longer need consumers in order to be able to make products for our, not products, but profits for our companies. That's essentially what's going on here. It's we're basically trying to, what's happening right now, if I were to sort of like summarize it right now, in the modern time, we're trying to go through another transitionary step of the capitalist form of economic production, which Marx talked about when he talked about more and more power and control being consolidated in the hands of the fewer and fewer people. They will essentially will no longer have a need for consumers at some point in time, where as a byproduct of that transition and further concentration of wealth and power, the inherent contradictions of the system are going to collapse in on themselves. We're starting to potentially see that collapse, or rather, I would more so say we are seeing its fragility be very, very much so displayed right in our faces.
Because I want to post it on social media. Okay? So, if you think about this, what this really is the perfection of slavery. Okay? Does it make sense? What does this phrase mean, the perfection of slavery?
Okay. This is the perfection of slavery? No one's going to be like a consume slave. There is no more fucking consumption. We're moving to a post-consumerist, like, this doesn't make any fucking sense. Where consumerism is now basically the same thing as, like, slavery? So everyone's going to be essentially a consumed slave in, like, company towns or something? Like, is that what Professor Jiang is essentially saying here? This doesn't make any fucking sense. Like, we're everyone's trying, like, unironically, all these corporations right now are trying to basically make it such that everything is a subscription model, so that you pay constantly into a subscription for the use of basic fucking services, so they can move to a post-consumer sort of society, to not have to make any more products, to have to make any sort of anything, and be able to make money hand over fist. That's like the purpose of all of these like subscription companies. Like, basically, you will own nothing and you will be happy. You will live in Zipod and you will eat Zibag, which is why everything is now becoming a fucking subscription model. You will have no ownership over any of your products. You will not be able to consume any fucking products. Post-consumerism. That's not consumerism being slavery. Companies don't really make fucking products anymore. This is nonsensical.
Yeah, you become a slave of the money, but what? Why is this perfect? Yes, okay. If you're a slave, you rebel, right? But you don't know you're a slave, and you like this, you choose this, then you will never rebel, okay? So the consumerism is the perfect.
What? There are slave rebellions that have happened all the fucking time. Okay, this is... So is he essentially saying that consumerism is like a mind control? Like, is Professor Jiang essentially saying that fucking the bourgeoisie is casting the perfect Tsukuyomi on the entirety of the fucking planet in order to put everyone in a dream-like consumerist state or something? Like what the fuck are you talking about? This is nonsense. This is silly. Yeah, guys, I am Madara Uchiha. Okay, I have opened up my third eye, the Rinne Sharingan. I am casting the it's not the perfect Tsukuyomi. I'm casting the eternal Tsukuyomi, okay? And I'm going to basically put everyone in a dreamlike state where they're going to be consuming debt slaves for the rest of eternity. No, that's not what's fucking happening, Professor Jiang. That's silly. It's unironically the Klaus Schwab meme of saying, like, you will live in the bad and you will own nothing. That's what's happening here. That's what post-consumerism is.
Perfection of slavery, okay? And that's why Francis Fukuyama thinks that consumerism is the end of history, because it is a system.
Oh, that's not what Francis Fukuyama meant by... Oh, no. That's not what he... No, that's not what he meant by this. Also, Francis Fukuyama basically, like, went back on a lot of the stuff that he said. No, that's not what he meant. What Francis Fukuyama basically meant in his book about liberalism, essentially being the end of the world, was a byproduct of the collapse of the fucking Soviet Union. Francis Fukuyama basically thought that as a byproduct of the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's not going to be any sort of like necessity or need to have any like competing political ideologies or hegemons needing to compete anymore, because the eternal big hegemon battle that happened in the Cold War is over. The United States won and the Soviet Union fucking collapsed. It is now essentially going to be eternal liberalism for the rest of eternity. That's what Fukuyama basically thought. Not like this like strange like... Because, by the way, he went back on all of this saying like, oh, I was completely fucking wrong. Like, I didn't think like... I thought this would be the end of history, right? Boy, was I fucking wrong. And... Oh man, dude, this is like terrible fucking analysis. What he was basically saying with the end of history, that the end of history happened as a byproduct of the Soviet Union collapsing, was that essentially there's going to be an eternal liberal world order, and that there wouldn't be like such a ridiculous concentration of wealth, that some baseline of material conditions would be maintained in line with what the New Deal basically helped to establish, that helped create the liberal international order to begin with. This is nonsense.
That achieves what the elites want, and the masses are unwilling and unable to protest and rebel. Okay, does that make sense? It's a perfect system.
No, this is fucking complete utter nonsense. Well, given the fact the entire ideological basis for as to why Professor Jiang is even coming up with this analysis, I suppose, is completely flawed from the beginning. The inevitable conclusion is completely fucking nonsensical. To essentially suggest that the bourgeoisie that are currently in power right now in the United States of America are essentially casting the eternal Tsukuyomi on the entirety of the planet to basically put everyone in a dreamlike state where they're essential consuming debt slaves for the rest of eternity is non-fucking sensical. That is fucking stupid. But then again, I wouldn't really expect anything less from a dude who thought basically that the 1930s was the time of the worker. I had no idea that basically the bourgeoisie was not in existence anymore during the 1930s. That's fucking news to me. Doesn't understand why social atomization basically began, and also the creation of fucking consumerism in the 80s. The whole historical material and Marxist sort of analysis here is completely off by about like 30 years at the best, if I'm going to be fucking charitable. This is just complete nonsense. And again, like, one of the main problems that I have specifically with Professor Jiang is his rather terrible interpretations of history, because he's got a BA in literature and non-history, man. So, and he uses his credentials as a professor in order to dupe a bunch of people into believing into a bunch of fucking goddamn nonsense. But yeah, I don't think there's really much else to say besides, Professor Jiang, you're still a fucking crank, bro.